Hello and welcome to this video showing you how we take a fuchsia that has been growing in a garden for a long time and turning it into a bonsai. The thing with fuchsias is they grow very long very quickly, but they do not thicken very quickly. This is where collecting a fuchsia from the wild, so to say, is beneficial. They often have a much thicker trunk than anything you can grow yourself in a timely manner. For instance, many nursery trees only have a trunk as thick as a pencil, if that. That also means that, because we're collecting this from the garden, we have a very solid trunk and some very interesting branches, but not a lot of other development. So now we have to figure out how to take the existing fuchsia structure and turn it into a bonsai. We have a few different examples, fortunately. The first thing we can do is cut this down to very little. That may cause you to feel squeamish, but it's not so very different from the way you might cut down a tree for copicing or pollarding. The top or area for new branches will lead to many new branches forming. That's to compensate for the fact that we've removed so much of the mass. Unlike a coppice or pollard, we do not need an excess of new branches, but we need a few solid branches. That is why we cut the fuchsia down to a short trunk. That will give us that branch structure at the very end. However, the challenge will be turning the mess that is the top of the trunk into something decent. What we will have in the end is something very similar to exactly what we've removed from above this point, a mass of new branches that lead to a bulbous growth. Now with a little bit of pruning, time and other work, we'll eventually have developed something closer to what we want. The first and easiest way to do that is to create a sloping trunk that tapers towards the top. In short, a giant jin or shari. Now it's not quite that simple, but it's very similar in basic concept. Now, because of how we want this to grow and everything else, the primary plan is to try and make the jin or shari on the bottom side of the trunk and allow the new growth to appear on the top, as we want to bring this back a short ways. Basically create a sort of C shape, if you will. It's just that the top of the C shape will be much shorter than the bottom. With all this in place, we now need to wait. Unlike most other specimens, where we would go through the pruning wiring process, this will just be pruning. Wiring fuchsias is an option, but the branches are very likely to break. They are fragile. Well, fragile may not be the right word. They are brittle. That is, they will not readily bend. That makes wiring hard and very likely to lead to a snap branch, not a bent branch. You're better off cutting and letting it grow out than you are wiring it in most cases. There are ways around it, but for the purposes of this video, we'll focus on the tried and true method, let's say. The next option and example we have with another fuchsia is a much better option, as it's not just a straight trunk. It has more movement and as a result a better appearance for a bonsai. In this case, we have a trunk with movement and a branch of good size coming out a short ways up the trunk. And by cutting that same trunk down to a reasonably short distance above this branch, we can turn that new trunk or leading branch into the new trunk. The benefits of this are that, well, it's a much better ratio and everything looks much neater. However, we will need to deal with the part of the trunk we've cut as a jin later on. It's going to be a bit of deadwood no matter what we do eventually, as there will be dieback. At the same time as we deal with that, it will let us create a better ratio and taper in the trunk. In fact, in this case, we have a tapered trunk, and that's a feature that's been missing from the previous example. The previous example was, more or less, almost dead straight. This won't be. It won't be a perfect taper, as it'll be more stepped, let's say, where we go from the very chunky basic trunk at the very bottom to a slightly thinner trunk further up and then a slightly thinner trunk again. But each of them is getting smaller, just that each of them is almost its own size, rather than being a continuous decrease in size. As we have a much better developed branch structure, we also need to begin pruning the branches that are here. We must remove some of the branches that are just growing in the wrong place. In others, we're taking the branches back to just two. That is, each one needs to be a fork, so to say. That is for the purposes of ramification, and although we won't get all the benefits we want now, we will get them in the future. Again, remembering dieback though. We need to cut them longer than we otherwise would normally, because the initial section, the first, let's say 2.5 centimeters or roughly 1 inch, will be the area of the branch that dies. Now there'll be a lot of variability in this, but it's a good general rule of thumb for fuchsias. Allow an extra inch or 2.5 centimeters of growth, or in this case dieback, when pruning, so prune that much further than what you want. The final example we have for you is a oddity, let's say, very much an oddity. It is that the bulbous growth we mentioned before, that is the very large round growth where the branches have previously been pruned away. It creates something similar to a round mass. You'll see this with plants in gardens, parks in particular, where they've basically had an arborist come through and just remove a branch back to a common point. They become very bulbous and growth, almost like a tumor. In this case, the plant was not well cared for before we removed it, and that's why these have developed. It does give us an opportunity to make the most of it, and the way we do it is very simple. We've obviously taken it, separated it out, and then cut it across at the widest point. This is a way to create a very broad nabari with a fuchsia, something you don't typically get. But understand, you are, to an extent, taking a certain risk by doing this. Remembering that the fuchsia, when it's done this way, the area you're cutting isn't going to take readily, let's say, to being replanted or attempting to treat it like a cutting. You are better off almost treating it like a air layer in the way you get it growing. But before you do that, and if you aren't inclined to try that, you can literally just cut it across at the widest point as we've shown here. The key is that because there are many branches growing already, we can use them almost right away, and in fact this might almost be ready to be grown as a exhibition piece if you have a better developed specimen than we have. It'll, if unchanged and let's say worked, look very much like an upside down jellyfish. And yes, that may sound rather funny, but it's literally what it looks like. It's all sorts of branches just growing up and all over the place. And to fix that, we need to start removing branches. That is, a lot of branches need to be removed. The problem we have is that the branches will die back further from the point at which you make the cut. And that's a problem for this. We need to compensate for that dieback, as when it happens, it will work its way down the branch and then eventually get back to that bulbous area. And since we need to worry about that happening, we cut them longer. Now, the dieback will occur anyway, and we'll have to remove that once the dieback is finished. But fortunately, at that point in time, there won't be any more changes or damage. It won't keep dying back once you remove it, because it's already deadwood. The danger is that if you make it too short, and this is the biggest risk, the bulbous part may experience dieback too. So you do need to be a bit cautious in how far you cut it back, and how far away you cut it back. You need to be reasonably accurate with this. And ultimately, the end result is fairly straightforward. And by choosing to focus on the main branch that we can find coming out of this, which ultimately became the biggest branch rather than the actual main branch, we're able to develop something more akin to a informal upright. Admittedly, it's not perfect and the ratios are all over the place still, but sacrifice branches and a lot of other work will eventually solve that. Now, this is how we took 3 different fuchsias and turned them into a bonsai of sorts. How well it lasts and how long it lives after the work we've done to it is a very big question. As with all bonsai, pruning can be dangerous if a species is not necessarily cooperative, or as is the case with this, liable to have dieback and other issues when pruned. The other issue though is that we can't really wire it, and since a lot of this is very aggressive work, let's say, the risk is very high in what may or may not happen yet. So we'll see how it works, and if it works out well, great. If not, well, unfortunately these trees were coming out anyway, and we've basically tried to give them a second go at life by repurposing them. Not everything is so lucky, and sometimes life just doesn't find a way, despite what Jurassic Park has taught us. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.